Welcome back to the Life and Operas of Verdi. This is Lecture 4, and it is entitled Nabucco, Part 1. By late November 1839, Verdi had an opera on the boards at La Scala, a contract for 3 more operas, and a publisher. Giuseppe Verdi and his wife Margherita Barezzi, each of them 26 years old, assumed that the bad times were finally behind them. And who could blame them if they thought so? With a 3-opera, 12,000 lira contract in his pocket, and this is when a lira was a lira, not the pre-Euro monopoly money we were familiar with, and cash beginning to come in from publications, the Verdis could finally pay off their debts and look forward to a little financial security. They were still young, and though they grieved for their 2 dead children, they figured they could always have more. I wish I could tell you that they were right, but sadly, I can't. Verdi began work on his next opera, the first of the 3 operas contracted by Morelli and La Scala, a comedy entitled Un giorno di regno, King for a Day. Around June 12, 1840, 5 months after the premiere of Oberto, Margherita suddenly became ill. The illness was diagnosed as rheumatic fever. In all likelihood, it was actually encephalitis. Her father, Antonio Barezzi, arrived on June 18th, 1 hour before Margherita died. Barezzi wrote in his diary, and we quote, "From a dreadful disease, there died in Milan at noon of the feast of Corpus Domini, in her father's arms, my beloved daughter Margherita, in the very flower of her youth and at the peak of her fortune. She was the faithful companion of the excellent young man Giuseppe Verdi, maestro di musica. I beg for peace for her pure soul, even as I weep over this tragic loss." Unquote. Verdi was desperate, despondent, near collapse. He later wrote, and I quote again, "A 3rd coffin went out of my house. I was alone, alone. In the space of 22 months, 3 loved ones had disappeared forever. I no longer had a family. And in the midst of this terrible anguish, I was compelled to write and finish an opera buffa, a comic opera." Unquote. Margherita's funeral services were held at the Basilica of Sant Ambrogio, where just 8 months before, funeral services had been held for Verdi's little boy, Icilio Romano Verdi. Verdi and Antonio Barezzi returned together to Busetto, and it was there that Verdi collapsed. According to his friend, Giuseppe Damalde, Verdi was so overwhelmed by his grief that, and we quote, "his profound sorrow led him to give up everything completely and forever. He thought of nothing but hiding himself in some dark corner and living out his miserable existence." Unquote. The dark corner was likely Verdi's old room in Barezzi's house, where he grieved and raged to the point that his friends and family worried for his safety and his sanity. Verdi wrote Morelli to tell him that he would not be returning to Milan and that he would not finish the opera. But the opera, King for a Day, already substantially written, had been announced and the rehearsals scheduled. And Morelli, may he be blessed forever, dug in his heels and refused to let Verdi out of his contract. Verdi dragged himself back to Milan, intending to break his contract with Morelli. Now, we don't know what was said or promised when the two finally met, but Verdi, distraught, went back to the little apartment he and Margherita had so recently shared and finished composing his comic opera in a little under 6 weeks. Un giorno di regno, King for a Day, was premiered on September 5th of 1840, and it was an unmitigated disaster, a total flop. The singers gave it a half-hearted performance, and while some of the numbers were applauded, others were whistled at and booed. As was customary, Verdi was in the orchestra pit during the first and, as it turned out, only performance of the opera. From the pit, seated between the cellos and the harpsichord, ostensibly to turn pages or help out in an emergency, replenish the orchestra's supply of coffee and Slim Jims, whatever, Verdi had a front row seat to the disaster as it unfolded. It was for Verdi an excruciating, humiliating evening, an evening he never, ever forgot. 20 years later, still stinging with hurt, he wrote, and we quote, "The audience abused the opera of a poor, sick young man, harassed by the pressure of the schedule and heartsick and torn by horrible misfortune. Oh, if the audience then had, I do not say applauded, but had borne that opera in silence, I would not have had the words to thank them. Today, I accept the public. I accept its whistles on the condition that I am not asked to give back anything in exchange for its applause," unquote. From that night in September of 1840 to the end of his life, over 60 years later, Verdi's personal relationship with the public was set in his own mind, and from Verdi's point of view, it was not an affectionate relationship. He later wrote, quote, "As a result of this fiasco, at 26, I already knew what the public meant. From then on, successes have never made the blood rush to my head, and fiascos have never discouraged me. If I continued with this unfortunate career of mine, it was because at 26 years old, it was too late for me to do anything else, and because I was not physically strong enough to go back to the fields," unquote. The morning after the premiere of Un Giorno di Regno, Morelli called Verdi into his office. Well, Verdi later said he expected to receive a full-blast dressing down, but Morelli, bless him once again, encouraged Verdi to take heart. The remaining performances of Un Giorno were canceled, but in their place, Morelli remounted Oberto, which received 17 more performances during that fall of 1840, and which was cheered and applauded by the very same Milanese audiences that had just jeered and booed Un Giorno. Nabucco. The cheers Verdi received during the fall of 1840 for Oberto fell on deaf ears, that is, on Verdi's deaf ears. In December of 1840, Verdi wrote Giovanni Ricordi and told him that he was through with music, done, finito, finished. A day or two later, Verdi ran into Bartolomeo Morelli on the street in Milan. If we are to believe Verdi's account of the story, and there's no reason why we shouldn't, then their accidental meeting was one of the most serendipitous moments in the history of music and the beginning of Verdi's rebirth, if we may call it just that. Verdi recalled what happened, and we quote, "Large snowflakes were falling, and Morelli, taking me by the arm, invited me to come with him to the director's office at La Scala. As we walked along, we chatted, and he told me that he was in a terrible fix because of a new opera he had to present. He had given the assignment to the composer Otto Nicolai, who was unhappy with the libretto. 'Imagine,' Morelli said, 'a libretto by Solera, stupendous, magnificent, extraordinary. Effective dramatic situations, grand, beautiful lines. But that crank of a composer refuses to look at it, saying that it's an impossible libretto.' As we were discussing this, we reached the theater. Morelli took a manuscript in his hand and, showing it to me, exclaimed, 'See, here it is, Solera's libretto. Such a beautiful plot. Imagine turning it down. Take it. Read it.' I said, 'What the devil do you want me to do with it? No, I have no desire to read librettos.' 'Well, it's not going to bite you,' Morelli said. 'Read it, and then bring it back to me.' And he handed me a huge sheaf of papers written in big letters, the kind they used to use then. I rolled it up, and saying goodbye to Morelli, I went off to my house. I went into my place, and with an almost violent gesture, I threw the manuscript on the table and stood straight in front of it. The bundle of pages falling on the table opened by itself. Without knowing why, I stared at the page before me and saw the line, 'Va pensiero sull'ali dorate,' fly, thought, on golden wings." We break momentarily from Verdi's reminiscence. His magnificent choral setting of the words, "Va pensiero sull'ali dorate," fly, thought, on golden wings, became the unofficial anthem of the Risorgimento, the 19th century Italian revolt against foreign occupation and oppression. When performed in the opera, the chorus is sung by the Israelites who are being held captive in Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar, or King Nabucco. When the opera was first performed at La Scala and then across Italy, it didn't take long for audiences to figure out that the Israelites' dream of freedom and homeland was their dream of freedom and homeland. Verdi's chorus almost immediately achieved the status of a national hymn, and to this day it might be sung by Italians at any time, in any place. Here are the words. Fly, my thought, on golden wings, fly, alight upon the slopes, the hills where soft and warm the sweet breezes of our native land are fragrant. Greet the banks of the Jordan and Zion's destroyed towers. Oh, my country so beautiful and lost.